When China ended its civil war in 1949 and became the Communist People's Republic of China, it sent shockwaves around the world. It was one of many events that year which contributed to the Second Red Scare in America. The Chinese Civil War was a conflict brewing since the fall of the Chinese monarchy in 1911. It would result in the most powerful communist country still active today, a quote-unquote communist country, predicted to become the world's dominant superpower this century. So, not wanting to be ignorant of the history of a re-emerging great power, let's talk about the Chinese Civil War. I'm your host David, and this is The Cold War. China's last imperial dynasty collapsed after a brief civil war in 1911. The Ching Dynasty had reigned in China from the 17th century, but suffered a centuries-long decline as a result of European interventions. The collapse followed a short civil war, and then the formation of a new Republic of China. This republic was, let's say, less than stable. Immediately after the death of China's president, Yuan Shikai, different factions began a power struggle. In this period, China was controlled by many different factions, depending on the specific region, and it's become known to historians as the warlord period. One disparate faction was the Kuomintang. They were a Chinese nationalist movement led by Sun Yat-sen. To win in this conflict, Sun looked to the world's powers to find an ally. The only one he could find was in 1921, when he began to receive support from the Soviet Union. At the same time, the Soviets also gave their support to another new political group in China, the Communist Party. In these early stages, the two groups had a common cause. This era of cooperation is often referred to as the First United Front. Their common enemies were, of course, the regional warlords. Until 1925, this actually worked out well. The communists were small. The Soviets provided both groups with military education, weapons, and the equipment they needed to fight the warlords. Things would only turn for the worse when Sun Yat-sen died in 1925. After the Kuomintang's leader's death, it became more and more right-wing and suspicious of the Soviets. The two groups split from each other in 1927. The Kuomintang had decided in a closed-door meeting that both the party and communist activities were a threat to their victory. In April of 1927, they arrested and imprisoned or executed many of the communist leaders in the Kuomintang. This purge pushed leftist members of the Kuomintang into the arms of the Communist Party. The Kuomintang's leader, Kai-shek, was a military man who had been a close ally of Sun Yat-sen. Chiang would wind up becoming the leader of the Kuomintang for the duration of the entire civil war. A plain, no-nonsense leader, he was extremely popular in China, having his own cult of personality. He was an ardent nationalist and had been part of the Kuomintang since near the beginning. Later that year, the communists assembled their own Red Army. They were smaller in number than the Kuomintang, but they could use the fact the warlords were hesitant to attack them. The two factions fought a cat-and-mouse series of campaigns for 10 years. Historians have very creatively named it the 10-Year Civil War. Then, everything changed as a result of Japan. In 1932, the Japanese invaded the northern Chinese region of Manchuria. In 1937, they followed this occupation with a full-scale invasion of China. Their army was better equipped and threatened to overwhelm the Kuomintang. This struggle forced a temporary alliance between the Kuomintang and the Communists, the so-called Second United Front. This alliance of convenience would continue for 8 brutal years, during which some of the worst atrocities in history scarred China. Iris Chang's The Rape of Nanking is an excellent, if not depressing, read on one of the worst examples of the atrocities committed. Even though allied, the two armies never really worked together. They were always trying to set things up so that when the fighting against the Japanese stopped, but the Civil War resumed, they would each have the upper hand. The only factor keeping the Civil War from breaking out again was that the war there became the eastern theater of the Second World War. Pressure from both the United States and the USSR kept them from each other's throats, at least for the time being. The war with Japan began to shape the next chapter of the Civil War in favor of the communists. The Kuomintang, as the official military of China, took heavy losses as they directly engaged the Japanese armies from Republican-held territory. The communists, on the other hand, preferred to use a form of guerrilla warfare. They also focused on areas occupied by the Japanese. The communists gained a reputation as a scrappy group of liberators fighting for the people. By the end of World War II, the communists, in number and support, were massive. Chiang's forces, in comparison, had drastically dwindled. After Japan's surrender, the communists and nationalists attempted a weak peace process. But the Soviet Union helped position the communists into the stronger position. And angled into a stronger position, they were. The communist forces had ballooned during the war to more than 3 million troops. They also held control of over a quarter of the country's land. The promise of land to the landless resulted in seemingly endless recruits and lots of food for the large, hungry Red Army. It should also be noted that a suspicious amount of Japanese equipment wound up in the Communist Army. It's also not likely a coincidence that the parts of the country the Kuomintang took from the Soviets had seen all its industrial base literally stripped off of the earth and shipped to the Soviet Union to be used in their reconstruction. The Kuomintang, of course, weren't without resources. The US supported their nationalist forces to the tune of 50,000 troops to help receive the surrender of the Japanese. They wanted to ensure land and supplies didn't fall into communist hands, not to mention supplies and equipment. Civil war broke out again in June of 1946. With a new war emerging, the US supporting one side and the USSR giving clandestine support to the other, we have the stage set for one of the earliest Cold War rivalries. The story that follows is what the People's Republic of China calls the War of Liberation. In July of 1946, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the first invasion against the communists, with more than 1 million soldiers. Knowing they were outnumbered, the leader of the communists, Mao Zedong, used a clever strategy. He had read his Sun Tzu and opted to avoid the Kuomintang soldiers where they were at their strongest. The communists preferred to retreat into the country where they had more local support. The nationalists suffered hard attrition as the communists gained more and more recruits to their cause. So now that we've mentioned him, let's talk a little bit more about Mao. He was the son of peasant farmers, albeit well-off peasant farmers. He identified both as a communist and a nationalist. This mix of what would eventually come to be referred to as communism with Chinese characteristics would become highly influential to East Asian communist movements. Even with the loss of their capital of Yan'an in Shaanxi province, the communists managed to avoid the brunt of the Kuomintang attack. The communists captured strategic cities in brutal counterattacks. They caught entire armies off guard and took all of their guns and, more importantly, their tanks. After a series of successful campaigns, the communists inched the Kuomintang further and further back. It got to the point where the Soviet Union worried it would set off the US. Stalin warned Mao against crossing the Yangtze River. Mao then thumbed his nose at Stalin and crossed it anyways. He pushed the entire Kuomintang to the island of Taiwan, a situation which continued until, well, today. On October 1st, 1949, Mao declared the foundation of the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek retreated all Kuomintang forces to Taipei on the island of Taiwan, or as they call it, the Republic of China. Both declare themselves the legitimate government of China to this day. The fighting didn't actually end then either. Smaller conflagrations and skirmishes continued for another 9 years. Though their angling is more political than military, the war hasn't actually officially ended. They still posture against each other, with the most recent crisis happening in the mid-1990s. Relations between China and Taiwan have been improving somewhat since 2008. Allies, such as the United States, might give aid and support for Taiwan, but at the risk of offending the People's Republic of China, only 18 countries have recognized Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek would continue to rule Taiwan until his death in 1975. The Republic of China, or Taiwan, remained as a member of the United Nations for several years. The UN reprimanded the USSR for giving support to the communist forces as it was in violation of a treaty of friendship. The Soviets, and Americans for that matter, learned early it's much more effective to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. In 1971, the UN admitted the People's Republic of China and expelled the Republic of China. Global recognition for Communist China became mainstream. Mao Zedong would rule China until his death in 1976. 1 year more than Ching, which might just be one final dig. As we continue this series, China will be a massive player on the global stage. China will play a significant role in the wars in Korea and Vietnam. Its relationship with the US and USSR over the decades will further complicate the dynamics of the Cold War. How that will happen are ways you'll have to keep watching to find out. And when you hear about tensions between China and Taiwan now, you will know their backstory. We're going to talk more about China in future episodes, so please make sure to hit the bell button and subscribe. We rely on our patrons to create these videos, so consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is the Cold War channel, and we will catch you on the next one.